They laughed when he said he was representing his cousin in court. They weren't laughing 20 minutes later. "Take that hood off, son. This isn't a rap video." That was the first thing Judge Harold Wexler said the moment 17-year-old Jalen Prescott walked into courtroom 2 Billions at the Maricopa County Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona. The place was already half full. Murmurs, whispers, quiet laughter. A few folks looked up from their phones. The bailiff tried hard not to smirk. Jalen didn't flinch. He calmly took the hood down, revealing short, twisted hair and sharp, dark eyes that didn't blink much. His clothes were plain. A faded gray hoodie, black jeans, scuffed-up sneakers with frayed laces. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was here for a truancy hearing. But he wasn't. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table, dropped his backpack beside the chair, and sat down like he'd been doing this every Monday since Christmas. Across from him sat the defense attorney, mid-40s tailored navy suit, silver glasses that never slipped, and a smug look that screamed, "This won't take long." Judge Wexler, now visibly annoyed, leaned forward from the bench and raised an eyebrow. "Are you lost, Mr. Prescott?" "Jalen Prescott. I'm here representing my cousin, Miss Tiana Rowe, in her civil claim case number 2023 CV7. The courtroom got quieter. "You're what now?" Wexler asked, voice rising slightly. "I am her legal representative. Pro se appointment. All documents were submitted and approved last Friday." Jalen reached into his backpack, pulled out a neatly clipped file and held it up. The bailiff, still side-eyeing him, walked it to the bench. Wexler adjusted his glasses, flipped through the papers. Approved. Judge's signature and all. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. "All right," Wexler sighed, setting the file aside. "We're doing circus acts now. Sure, you watch a few episodes of Law and Order and now you're Clarence Darrow. Fine. Let's pretend this isn't absurd." The audience chuckled again, low but sharp. A few heads shook. An older woman in the back row whispered something to her neighbor, and they both chuckled. Still, Jalen didn't bite. He just opened his own case file, flipped a few pages, and scribbled something on a yellow notepad. The defense attorney stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we're happy to proceed, but for the record, we reserve the right to request a dismissal based on the plaintiff's decision to be represented by a minor." Judge Wexler waved that off with a half laugh. Let the boy make a fool of himself. He wanted the spotlight. Let's see what he does with it. That's when Jalen looked up for the first time since taking his seat. With a calmness that didn't match his age, he asked, "Before we proceed, Your Honor, may I verify that opposing counsel has disclosed all documentation related to the February 8th lease violation, the emails, photos, timestamp notices?" The room stilled again. Wexler blinked. The defense attorney hesitated. Those weren't included in initial discovery due to timing issues, so they were omitted." Jalen cut in despite being material to the central claim. Wexler looked between them. The defense attorney straightened his tie, suddenly uncomfortable. "I'll allow a 5-minute recess for you to produce the missing documentation," Wexler muttered, frowning slightly. "Don't make a habit of cutting corners." Jalen sat back, nodded once, and wrote something else down. He hadn't even started his argument, but the courtroom already felt different. The silence that followed wasn't boredom. It was curiosity. But Wexler wasn't done testing him, and Jalen hadn't even warmed up. Jalen was born in South Phoenix, about 10 blocks from where his cousin Tiana's apartment complex now sits, half boarded up with paint peeling off the side walls and broken mailboxes zip-tied shut. It wasn't the kind of place where people talked about civil court, but his mother did. Her name was Patrice. She worked front desk at a pediatric clinic for 16 years and never once missed a shift. She knew how to stretch a dollar like it was dough, and she knew exactly how many hours you had to work to keep the lights on, the fridge running, and the rent paid 3 days early so the landlord wouldn't come sniffing around. His father, he left when Jalen was 5. Left a stack of bills in a half-packed suitcase, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Jalen wasn't bitter about it. He just learned early on that no one was coming to save them. He was the kind of kid who sat quietly in the back of class, hoodie up, scribbling things in the margins of his notebook.
Teachers thought he wasn't paying attention.
He was, just not to them. When his uncle got arrested over a parking violation that spiraled into a bogus resisting charge, Jalen started reading, not just articles, court transcripts, city ordinances, Supreme Court summaries on Google Scholar. It started with anger, but then came interest, then obsession. By the time he was 15, he could recite Part TS of Arizona's tenant laws from memory. 16, he was drafting sample responses to eviction notices just for practice. On weekends, while kids from his school were at the mall or trying to sneak into clubs, he was watching public court cases online and breaking them down like a coach reviewing game tape. No one took it seriously except his mother. She didn't say much, but one night while folding laundry, she looked at him and said, "You'd make a damn good lawyer." Then she went back to matching socks. That stuck. It got real the day Tiana came home in tears, waving a notice from her landlord, accused of breaking a lease over a noise complaint that wasn't even hers. A neighbor had filed it while Tiana was working a double shift at the hospital. Jalen knew it smelled wrong, and when she couldn't afford an attorney, he stepped up, not with arrogance, but with determination. He did the research, pulled city records, compiled timestamps, security logs, and got 2 affidavits from neighbors who'd overheard the property manager say he was trying to clear out the Section 8 people by the summer. Jalen was 17, no license, no car, no social media. But his binder was thick, his arguments solid, and he knew he had a legal right under Arizona law to represent a family member in civil court with proper approval. So, he filed the paperwork, got it notarized, and waited. Then he showed up in court. No one expected much, but that was the thing about Jalen. He never walked into a room loud. He just let silence follow him when he left. But back in courtroom 2 billions, silence was starting to feel heavy, and Judge Wexler wasn't ready to let go of control. Tiana Rowe was 24, worked nights at St. Joseph H's hospital, and took care of her little brother Kalen, who had asthma so bad it sometimes kept him out of school for days. She wasn't the type to cause trouble. She paid her rent on time, kept her place clean, and didn't complain, even when the heat went out in January. But her building was changing. New management came in 6 months ago with plans to modernize. That meant higher rent, stricter rules, and a quiet push to get rid of tenants who didn't fit their vision. The pressure started small. Letters for minor violations, random inspections, complaints about excessive noise from tenants who were never even home. Then came the February 8th complaint, a noise violation report supposedly filed by a neighbor. Loud music, yelling, possible fighting. Only thing was Tiana had clocked into work at 6:45 p.m. that night and didn't leave the hospital until after 7 the next morning. Kane had stayed overnight with a friend. They weren't even home. She tried to contest the claim with the property manager, but he shut her down. "We have the right to terminate based on repeated violations. This isn't personal." Except it was because 2 other families in the building, black single-parent households, had already been forced out with the same kind of warnings. No hearings, no questions, just intimidation wrapped in official-sounding letters. That's when she called Jalen. He didn't answer right away. He was in school, sneaking glances at a legal textbook he'd hidden behind his Chromebook. But when he saw the missed call and the text that followed, "They're trying to evict me by the end of the month," he left class without permission, hopped on a city bus, and showed up at her apartment by dinner. They sat at her kitchen table with bills spread out like playing cards. He didn't talk much, he just listened, wrote things down, asked questions. Then he pulled out his laptop, created a folder called Row 5th Holstead MGMT, and started building a case. Emails, timestamps, shift logs, building policies, Arizona's tenant protection laws. He compiled it all. He found out the complaint wasn't signed. No witness, no audio, no written statement, just a vague report and an email chain between the building supervisor and the regional property director talking about revitalizing the tenant profile. He even tracked down the neighbor who supposedly filed the complaint. Miss Cheney, apartment 3B, a retired woman with a walker and a garden of potted plants outside her door. When he asked her about the complaint, she looked confused. "I don't even know that girl," she said. "I didn't write nothing. I ain't heard nothing either." That was the nail. Jalen typed up a letter of intent to dispute the violation and filed it under Tiana's name. When the property manager didn't respond, he filed a civil complaint for wrongful eviction. A week later, they received a court date. When Jalen showed up with his approval to act as a proc representative, the clerk looked at him twice, asked for ID, verified the paperwork 3 times. It was valid. But paperwork didn't stop prejudice, and when they walked into courtroom 2B that morning, it was like everyone had already made up their mind. Jalen wasn't supposed to be there, not dressed like that, not that young, not that confident. But he didn't come to play dress-up. He came to make them regret underestimating him. Still, knowing the law wasn't enough. Now he had to prove he belonged in a room that was doing everything to make him feel like he didn't. "Let's keep this short," Judge Wexler said as he straightened the stack of papers in front of him. "We've got 3 other cases backed up already." He was already tired, not of work, of Jalen, of the entire situation. It showed in the way he sighed before speaking, in how he rolled his pen between his fingers like it was a waste of time. "Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Try not to turn this into a TED Talk." Jalen stood up, no papers in hand, just a yellow notepad and a pen tucked behind his ear. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to address the court's assumption that my presence is a novelty." "Objection," the defense attorney interrupted. "Is this an opening statement or a personal grievance?" Jalen turned his head, calm as ever. "It's context, and I'll move forward." He walked slowly to the front, looked around the courtroom, then focused on Wexler. "This case isn't about noise. It's about power. My cousin Tiana Rowe is a working-class tenant in a complex that's being quietly cleared of families that don't fit a certain profile. She was accused of violating her lease while she was clocked in at St. Joseph's, 45 minutes away. No evidence, no signature, just a typed-up report. We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for facts." The room was still again. You could hear the creak of the bench as someone shifted their weight. Wexler scratched his chin, not amused, not impressed, just annoyed. "And you've got proof of all this?" he asked flatly. "I do," Jalen said, reaching into his backpack and handing a tabbed binder to the bailiff. Inside were timestamps from Anna's time card, a statement from Ms. Cheney denying the complaint, and building-wide notices showing a pattern of selective enforcement. In one section, he printed out an internal email chain acquired legally through a resident complaint that showed management discussing a long-term tenant replacement strategy. Wexler flipped through the binder. "Well organized, but you realize that evidence alone doesn't win a case." Jalen didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor, but facts have a tendency to speak louder than sarcasm." The room shifted. Someone in the gallery choked back a laugh. Wexler leaned back in his chair and stared at Jalen like he was sizing him up for the first time. "You think you're clever?" "No, I think my cousin deserves housing security like anyone else." The defense attorney rose again, clearly annoyed. "Objection, Your Honor. He's grandstanding." "Overruled," Wexler muttered. He still didn't like the kid, but he was starting to listen. Jalen continued, this time addressing the judge directly in accordance with Rs. Wester 331,367. "Tenants have the right to dispute retaliatory or baseless eviction threats. Ms. Rowe was not issued a formal hearing, was not given a chance to respond in writing, and received no copy of the alleged complaint. These are procedural violations that undermine her rights and place her at risk of homelessness for a noise complaint that never existed." He said that last part slowly, not dramatic, just steady, plain. Wexler didn't speak for a while. The defense attorney tried to shift focus, claiming Tiana had a history of behavioral complaints, but Jalen countered each one with documentation proving they were vague, unsupported, or flat-out false. "Yo, you came prepared," Wexler said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Jalen didn't smile. He wasn't here for that. He just stood there calm as ever, hands folded. But the hardest part wasn't making his case, it was surviving a system that expected him to fail from the moment he opened his mouth. The courtroom didn't feel the same anymore. What started as entertainment for some, a kid trying to be a lawyer, was now uncomfortable, quiet. People were leaning forward instead of laughing. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Jalen walked back to the plaintiff's table and opened his binder again, flipping straight to the back. "I'd like to call my first witness," he said. "Miss Cheney, apartment 3B. The judge blinked. "You brought a witness?" "Yes, Your Honor. She's present and willing to testify." The older woman with the walker, Miss Cheney, stood up slowly from the gallery. She moved with care, her steps small, but her eyes focused. Jalin offered her an arm as she made her way to the front. Once seated and sworn in, Jalin approached. "Miss Cheney, did you file a noise complaint against Miss Tiana Rowe on February 8th? "No, I did not," she said without hesitation. "Were you asked to?" "Not directly, but the manager came by earlier that week asking questions about the younger tenants. Said he was trying to clean things up." "Did you ever observe Ms. Rowe causing disturbances in the building?" "Never. That girl works harder than anybody in the building." "And did anyone from management inform you a report had been filed in your name?" "No. First time I heard about it was from this young man right here." Jalin nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney stood up, but Wexel R. raised a hand. "No need," he said quietly. "Let her rest." The room stayed still as Miss Cheney made her way back to the bench with help from the bailiff. Jalin turned back to the judge. "We also have time-stamped security footage from the hospital where Ms. Rowe works. It confirms her entry and exit on the date in question. Her supervisor also submitted a signed statement verifying her shift hours." He slid a USB across the table. The courtroom projector came to life. The screen showed a grainy hallway, 6:45 p.m. Tiana walking in, hospital badge around her neck, hair pulled back, scrubs on. Next clip, 7:15 a.m. Her exiting the same hallway, shoulders slumped, hair messy, exhaustion on her face. Wexler tapped his pen slowly against his desk. The defense attorney didn't speak. He was staring at the screen, arms crossed, jaw tight. When the footage ended, Wexler looked at Jalin. "Mr. Prescott, you've made your point." Jalin didn't relax. He stood still. "There's one more thing," he said. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and handed it to the bailiff. It was from another tenant, Maria Estes, a single mother who'd moved out 2 months earlier after receiving 3 vague notices of lease violations. In the letter, she described the intimidation, the letters, and how the property manager told her, "It's easier for everybody if you just leave." The judge read it silently, lips pressed into a thin line. After a long pause, he leaned forward and rested his hands on the bench. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said slowly, "and I've never seen a kid walk in here with this level of preparation, confidence, and evidence, especially not without a law to agree." He looked at Jalin for a long time, then at the defense attorney. "You've got a lot to answer for," he told the lawyer. Turning back to Jalin, he added, "Your case is compelling. More than that, it's airtight." Jalin didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. But this wasn't about praise. It was about the fact that no one expected him to make it this far. And yet, here he stood unshaken. The courtroom didn't clap. No one stood. This wasn't a movie. But the energy had shifted. Even the court reporter glanced at Jalin now with something different in her eyes, something like respect. The defense attorney, Mr. Brian Lell, stood up finally, clutching a folder that suddenly felt thinner than it had that morning. "We'd like to motion for a short recess to review this new material," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Wexler shook his head. "You've had weeks to prepare. The footage is dated. The letter is signed. You were informed of the witnesses in the case summary." He tapped the bench with his pen. Motion denied. "Continue." Lell walked slowly back to his table, flipping pages like they'd rearranged themselves. He tried again, this time pushing for dismissal based on procedural irregularities, but the judge cut him off. "Irregularities like not producing the lease logs when asked," Wexler said, raising an eyebrow. Silence. Jalin glanced down at his notepad, then turned to look at Tiana. She sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap. Her leg bounced under the table, but her face was unreadable. He leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" She nodded barely. Back at the bench, Wexler cleared his throat. "Let's be honest here," he said. "This wasn't supposed to be a real case. Not in your mind, Mr. Lell. Not in mine either, if I'm being truthful." Lell shifted. "You thought you'd walk in, call the bluff, and it would be over in 15 minutes. But it turns out this young man did more homework than most third-year associates I've had in front of me. Jalin didn't react, not out of pride, but because the fight wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to call the building manager," Jalin said. "Objection," Lel snapped. "He wasn't listed in the he was subpoenaed, responded via email. The court has a copy of the confirmation," Jalin replied, flipping to the exact page and sliding it toward the judge. Wexler scanned it, then nodded. "He's in the hallway. Bring him in." The door opened, and in walked a stocky man in his late 30s with a clipboard and an attitude. His name was Phil Hayworth, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat down, took the oath, and folded his arms. Jalin stepped up. "Mr. Worth, can you explain why Ms. Rowe was issued a violation for a complaint that can't be traced to any resident?" "I had a report," Phil said flatly. "From who?" I don't remember the name. It was written down. Where is it now? I don't have it. Might have gotten lost." "You filed a lease violation based on an anonymous claim with no supporting evidence. Is that correct?" "Look, I manage over 100 tenants. Yes or no?" Phil glanced at the judge, then back at Jalin. Yes." Jalin opened the binder to a printout. "Did you write this email to your regional manager on February 10th? We're going to start removing the problematic ones, starting with 2 degrees Celsius. They won't fight it." Phil's eyes widened. That was taken out of context. "What's the context where Cal Ling tenants' problems is okay?" Silence. "Do you consider working-class tenants a problem?" Phil looked like he wanted to disappear. He looked at the judge, but Wexler didn't blink. "No further questions," Jalin said. Phil was dismissed. When he walked past the gallery, a few people shook their heads. Miss Cheney stared at the floor. Back at the plaintiff's table, Jalin sat down slowly. His jaw was tight now, not from nerves, but from holding everything in. The anger, the frustration, the exhaustion from staying up all night researching rental codes and legal definitions. It was finally coming out, but not in shouts, in facts. But even with the truth on your side, justice isn't guaranteed, not until someone has the courage to make the room uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Wexler sat still, chin resting on one hand, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked like he was seeing the courtroom differently now, like the walls had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Jalin stayed seated, not because he was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary anymore. Everything he needed to say had been said. Tiana whispered, "What happens now?" Jalin didn't answer right away. He just looked at the judge, waiting. Wexler finally sat up straight and cleared his throat. "This court finds the complaint issued against Miss Tiana Rowe to be without merit. The eviction process was initiated without sufficient evidence, with procedural inconsistencies, and with what this court can only describe as a troubling pattern of selective enforcement." The words hit hard, not just because they were a win, but because they were real, documented, spoken aloud, on record. "In addition, Wexler continued, "the court recommends the matter be reviewed by the appropriate housing authority for possible violations of the Arizona Fair Housing Act." LOL tried to interject. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," Wexler replied without looking at him. "You had your chance." He turned toward Jalin now. His expression had changed, still stern, still formal, but there was something else under it. A pause, a kind of weight behind his voice that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "I owe you an apology." Jalin tilted his head slightly. "When you walked into this room, I dismissed you. I saw a hoodie. I saw a teenager. I didn't see an advocate. That was my mistake." Somewhere in the back row, someone murmured, "About time." Wexler didn't flinch. "You have demonstrated extraordinary skill, knowledge, and self-control. You defended your family with dignity. You navigated complex legal standards with clarity, and you kept your composure under pressure most adults couldn't handle." Jalin gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said, quiet. Even Wexler looked down at his paperwork, then back up. "This court session is adjourned." The gavel struck once. It was done. No applause, just quiet. Tiana exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Her shoulders dropped. She turned to Jalin, eyes full, but not crying. "You did it." He didn't smile. He just stood up, closed his binder, and packed it into his backpack like it was just another Tuesday. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. The clerk approached him on the way out and tapped his shoulder. "Hey," she said, "you ever think about taking the bar one day?" You've got something. Jalen gave her the same calm look he gave Ev. Arion, maybe if they'll let me. Outside the courthouse, the air was warmer. People walked past like nothing had happened inside. Jalen and Tiana sat on the bench near the bus stop, the same one where they waited an hour just a week ago to file the paperwork. She nudged him with her shoulder. Seriously, thank you. He nodded, watching a car pull up and idle at the curb. Just didn't want to see you pushed out for no reason. But how did you even learn all that? He looked down, fiddling with the zipper on his backpack. I had to. Nobody else was going to do it. Tiana didn't say anything. She just leaned back, watching the clouds move over the sun. Jalen finally cracked a smile. Not big, but real. You hungry? I'm starving. I got $20. Then you're buying. They both laughed. Not loud, but it carried. Because in a system that rarely listens, one calm voice backed by truth can echo louder than a room full of titles. Some stories don't need explosions to make noise. Sometimes the loudest moment is when a teenager in beat-up sneakers proves that intelligence doesn't come with a dress code, and justice doesn't belong only to those in suits. Jalen Prescott didn't walk into that courtroom looking like anyone's idea of a hero, but he walked out with something more powerful than approval. He walked out with proof that knowledge can shake a system, that preparation beats perception, and that when you stand up for someone else, even when you're underestimated, disrespected, and talked down to, you can make people see what they've ignored for years. Judge Wexler saw it. The courtroom saw it. And if we're paying attention, we should see it too. Because every neighborhood has a Jalen, some quiet kid in the back of the room, some kid who watches more than he talks, who reads, listens, and remembers everything. But the world keeps trying to tell him to sit down, to stay in his lane, to wait his turn. What if he didn't? What if we actually made space for voices like his before they had to fight their way in? If this story made you think even just a little, share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself who gets overlooked in your own life. And if you're the one people keep underestimating, stay ready. Stay sharp. Speak up when it counts. They'll hear you eventually.